Hey guys, and welcome back to the first video about actual language learning. We're gonna talk about my Dutch learning journey that has been going on for I think 3.5 years at this point, I'm not sure. But at the beginning of the year, I said that for the first half of the year, I just was gonna be really busy with school and that I could only focus on one language, and that language of choice was gonna be Dutch because it would be really easy for me to keep up with. And there's only one language that has always been fun to learn, that has always made me happy, always brought me joy, and never added to my stress. A lot of people were a little surprised, which isn't surprising because in the past 2 years I have not talked about my Dutch learning at all. But if you've been a follower since, I want to say 2021, then you may remember these two videos where I did talk about the beginning, the really early beginning of my Dutch learning. The unfortunate thing is that I never documented what happened after that, even though the things that happened after this were way more exciting. But that is exactly what I'm going to catch you up on today. Just to recap really quickly and catch everyone that hasn't seen the other two videos up to speed, I started learning Dutch basically back in 2020. When I was really bored in Japan of learning Japanese all the time, and I came across the Lang Jam challenge, which I think unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, but it's basically a challenge where you get assigned a language and for one weekend you just dabble in the language. I was given the choice between Dutch and Vietnamese, and I chose Dutch for whatever reason and decided to just, learn a bit of Dutch for a weekend. After the challenge, I decided to keep going because I really loved how much I could basically understand from the get-go and how much progress I was able to make in just 2 days. So I continued reading the link stories, which, yes, I've been a link user since 2020 at least. And then I also listened to some podcasts and YouTube videos just to get a feel for the language. It's not like it was a lot, and I think in the span of 3 or 4 months I accumulated 40 hours of listening and about 120,000 words, so 130 to 150 pages. Nothing crazy, but a good start. Up until this point, my Dutch learning was really just for fun, because it was fun doing something other than learning Japanese all the time. And it was also really inconsistent. I had no goals, no intentions with getting good at the language or anything, but all that changed in September of 2020. Before I go on to tell you about this next era of my Dutch learning, which I want to call the golden era of Dutch learning because it was glorious. I did a lot during that time. I do want to remind you that German is my native language and that learning Dutch is really easy because there's so much grammatical and vocabulary overlap. It would be much harder for me to do the exact same thing if I had decided to learn French or Spanish or any other language that's not Dutch, basically. I have a lot of videos on this channel where I give a more realistic view for other languages that are more distant to your native language, so feel free to check those out if you want to have a more realistic timeline. Okay, with that out of the way, what happened in September 2020? I had to take additional classes to get my degree, and it could have been anything really, but I remembered that I had a lot of fun learning Dutch, so I figured I could just take a Dutch language class. But silly me didn't want to take the A2 class, I just wanted to get straight to the B1 class. Mind you, I had about 5 weeks between making the decision to take Dutch classes and before the classes actually starting, so in that time I would have to bridge this massive gap between the knowledge I had at the time and the knowledge I needed to be admitted to the B1 class. Nothing you couldn't fix with a lot of studying, and that is what I did. I read through all the Link mini stories and some other easy material that I could find on Link, and then just hopped right into my first book, which was 20,000 Miles Under the Sea, which I also listened to the audiobook at the same time to get the listening and the reading practice at the same time. The first, I want to say 40 pages were painful. I was really slow. I had to replay the audio so many times. I had to look up so many words. It was not a fun experience. I somehow pushed through and finished the whole book in about a month, and then took the placement test and was admitted to the B1 class. I was really happy, But when I joined the class, it was a lot harder than I thought because all I had done up until that point was listening and reading, and I had no experience speaking. So my speaking compared to all the other students in that class was really, really bad. For most of October and November, I was focused on getting my speaking up to the level of the other students so that I could participate in class easier and then eventually finish the class and pass the test. But what was more interesting is that in December I started an internship, and to get to the internship there was a commute that would take me about 20 minutes. I told myself I was gonna be reading Dutch on the way there and back every time I went to the internship. By that time I had read 2 books so far, which was 20,000 Miles Under the Sea and then In 80 Days Around the World. And the delusional me just decided to read Anna Karenina for my commute time. And it was really difficult at first. It's a really long book and it took me a long time to make any progress because I would be reading so slowly. But you'd honestly be surprised how much progress you can make if you consistently read an hour every day. And so I did make a lot of progress in December. When I started, I could read about 5-ish pages on one way, so in about 20 minutes. But by the end of December, I could already read at a speed of about 15 pages in 20 minutes. I did eventually finish that book at the end of December, and I was pretty proud because it's a pretty difficult book. It's a really long book, but I still managed to get through somehow. And up until that point, I had read a total of 500,000 words, which is already a lot. But then that is nothing compared to what I read in the first quarter of 2021. I read The Little Prince on New Year's Day, and I moved on to the Aragon series, which took me about 2 months, probably, a little less maybe. But those were a little hard in the beginning because there were a lot of fantasy related words that I just wasn't familiar with yet. But by about the second half of the second book, Dutch had become so easy to read and it felt so comfortable to read that I really wasn't struggling anymore at all. I could have totally read the books without the help of Link. When I finished that, I read The Hobbit. Then to change the genre a little bit, I read The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F***. Then I decided to go back to the Lord of the Rings series, which I really didn't like, and just stopped reading at the first half of the second book or something. After that, I read Brave New World, which again, that was a bit of a harder one just because the concepts are quite hard to grasp. But I had a lot of fun reading it, learned a lot of new words from that book as well. And then I think the final breakthrough for my Dutch reading ability was when I started to read the Erica Foster series, which, such a good series by the way. If you like mystery, crime, detective stories, you gotta read that series, it's so good. So the first book, it took me a while to get used to all the words that were crime related, obviously, since up until that point I had only read fantasy kind of books. But then by the time I started the second book, I read incredibly fast. There were barely any new words for me, and I just had so much fun reading. I breezed through those books. By June 2021, so a little more than a year after I had first started to learn Dutch, I had reached 2.7 million words read, which 2.5 of those were just in the time period from December to June. Now thinking back, it's actually crazy. The amount of Dutch that I read in that time and how much progress I made in such a short period of time is actually astounding, and I feel like I don't give myself enough credit for it. But I am really proud of what I accomplished, and I did have a lot of fun, and there is no better feeling than just seeing that words read number climb and climb every day. In the second quarter of 2021 is when my golden Dutch era starts to fade out a little bit. I just became less interested, I became more busy with other things. I did still read the first book of the Outlander series, which is also a really long series, and I finished the first book in maybe May or something. And I think that is when I first started to feel like my Dutch reading was actually better than my English reading, which is crazy because I can't speak Dutch at all. My spoken English is obviously really good, but then it's obviously the skills that you train that are gonna get better. So I read a lot in Dutch, so my reading in Dutch is going to be really good. I never read in English, so my English reading is going to be really bad, but it is quite interesting to see. Since summer 2021, I stopped thinking of reading Dutch as studying just because it is so effortless and I don't encounter a lot of new words anymore. That doesn't mean that I don't encounter any new words, but the rate at which I encounter them is extremely low. I have since also felt really comfortable taking really long breaks, and whenever I get back, I pretty much just can get right back into it. It takes me a few days to get up to speed again, but then as soon as I read a few days, my reading speed is just basically back to where it was before. And that brings us to pretty recently, because for a pretty long time I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my Dutch. I was honestly fine just reading and waiting for magically waking up one day speaking fluent Dutch, but obviously I know that that's not going to happen because the skills that you practice are the skills that are going to get better. And if I never practice speaking, I'm never going to get good at speaking. At the Polyglot Gathering, I realized that I do want to be able to speak to some extent. Now, I don't need my speaking ability to be the same as my reading ability because catching that up would take literally years. But I think being able to hold a simple conversation should be achievable. I have a really high level of vocabulary already, and just activating those, knowing how to use them, learning chunks that I can just say as phrases together would honestly be really helpful. So I do want to incorporate some level of speaking practice, which will have to include pronunciation practice, but also just learning how to hold a conversation in Dutch. What fillers are there? How can I say certain things? How can I ask certain things? I'll definitely take you along on that journey of going from literate in Dutch to fluent in Dutch. And I'm really excited for it. I hope that in a year or so I can go to the Polyglot Gathering and hopefully hold a conversation in Dutch. So feel free to follow along on the journey. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.